I'll just get started with a little bit of an introduction for Center for Internet and Society. We're a nonprofit organization based out of India. We work on various issues of digital rights, access to knowledge, intellectual property, internet governance, and other questions of digital privacy and cybersecurity. This particular research on AI for healthcare was supported by a grant from Notre Dame IBM Tech Ethics Lab. And it was also, of course, not an individual effort. It was a large team that worked, me along with my colleagues at CIS, who I've also named here, Shweta, Bhineet, Chetna, Sneha, and Yatharth. We worked on this project for almost about 2 years. So with that, I'll probably just get started on, the context and the scope of this study. So this report essentially tries to understand what is the current use of AI practices in healthcare sector in India. And we do that by trying to sort of map the data supply chain underlying these AI technologies that are currently being used or prototyped for healthcare in India. And some of the key research questions that we wanted to look at was, in an exploratory fashion, trying to understand what really is the current data supply chain infrastructure. Our secondary research gave us some understanding, but it was not, something that was very widely available. That information was widely available. So that was one of the first questions that we wanted to sort of get into. Secondly, we also wanted to sort of understand what are, if any, auditing practices that are being followed by technology companies and healthcare institutions in India. And lastly, we try to offer certain best practices for various organizations as well as policymakers who are trying to adopt AI and trying to also think about other governance mechanisms such as auditability in the absence of regulatory mechanisms. So a little bit about the methods of the study. This was fairly exploratory, like I was mentioning. There isn't a lot of work or a lot of information that is already available in the public domain on, the extent of AI use in healthcare, in public health or primary health, tertiary healthcare settings. And therefore, the first order of business really was to sort of map what is the existing knowledge, sort of define our hypotheses, and then identify what are certain key organizations that we would like to speak with or organizations that are already working in this space. We also want to mention that this study has received an institutional review board approval, which came in December 2023. It was an elaborate review, which essentially encompassed examination of the study's design, ethical considerations, looked at a risk assessment matrix, and also how the data was going to be managed and stored. This was a mixed method study. So we did a quantitative survey, and this was a self-administered survey that we did with the help of a third-party data collection agency. The sampling methods were fairly sort of, like I said, exploratory, so purposive sampling methods. We looked at expert sampling approaches to identify individuals within the healthcare AI ecosystem who were, had certain areas of expertise to actually be talking to this issue or taking this survey. The total sample size for this study was 500 respondents. And we really wanted to get to everybody who is a key stakeholder, or at least some of the key stakeholders of, the healthcare AI ecosystem. So we spoke to medical practitioners. We spoke to 175 representatives from healthcare institutions. These could be non-medical staff, administrative staff, management staff as well, but who are affiliated with certain healthcare institutions, both public and private. And lastly, we also spoke to respondents from technology companies, and these could be healthcare startups, these could be ITES companies that are in any way sort of involved in the overall AI value chain for healthcare. And of course, also big tech technology companies. Some of the broad themes that we covered were questions of course, the familiarity and use of AI, certain questions around practices when it comes to the data supply chain of AI, challenges that organizations face, and opinions of future use. Of course, we also wanted to complement this with fairly detailed, in-depth interviews with experts. And these experts really sort of were across the board, not just limited to medical practitioners, healthcare institutions, technology companies, but also policymakers, civil society actors, patient advocacy groups, and academics who've been working in these spaces of AI, healthcare, privacy, and regulation. Again, so the questions were somewhat similar, and also trying to understand a little bit more around the regulatory frameworks as well, as to what are the certain regulatory gaps that exist, and are there any sort of alternatives to the regulations that alternatives to the sort of regulations that don't exist, essentially. So alternative accountability mechanisms. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the use cases that we looked at for AI in healthcare. This is non-exhaustive. We give some of these examples in our report to say what do we mean by healthcare AI, and we have tried to sort of consolidate a few examples. So we look at image-based diagnosis. We look at and diagnosis is really one space where AI has been making certain advancements and is being actually tested and tried in different healthcare settings, even in India and globally as well. But also things like primary health consultations, where there are healthcare chatbots, or administrative and management, where, for example, Microsoft AI's automation tools allow for easy documentation of electronic health records or electronic medical records. Of course, there's great use of this, a lot of use of AI in drug discovery, but that was something that we kept out of the scope of this study. And epidemiology is also an important area for AI. We have seen it, at least in India, for example, there's Vadvani AI's event-based disease outbreak monitoring, which essentially scans digital media to track events that signal an impending disease outbreak. And we've also seen other organizations like ArtPark, which sits within the Indian Institute of Science, which has also done similar work in disease surveillance and epidemiology. And of course, lastly, there's medical research where AI has made some advancements as well. So how did we sort of come into this study? I think we identified certain kinds of gaps, which were sort of the entry points for us to look at, okay, is auditing something that can be looked at as a response? So to talk a little bit about the regulatory and policy developments, I mean, we are fresh off the AI Action Summit. There's a lot of conversations around governance, not governing AI, not having regulations to promote, the innovation, sort of binaries of innovation and regulation, although I don't necessarily agree with those binaries, but that's, I'm guessing for another time. But at this point, I think the situation was that in India, at least, we don't have a clear AI regulation. And there are certain regulations that exist. For example, within the healthcare sector, there are regulations that exist, such as the medical devices rule, telemedicine guidelines, but there are also other regulations, but we don't exactly know how they cover AI applicability. There's also the Data Protection Act and the rules that were recently notified, but again, they do not have specific definitions for sensitive or health data. There are certain policies about data collection that from the Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission, for example. But again, they're more related to health data and digitization and data collection, and less to do with AI in itself. So there is really a lot of sort of uncertainty around how the data that gets collected is then used for AI systems. What are the questions of mission creep that it raises, and various other questions of biases. And currently, those are not fully addressed from the regulatory frameworks that exist. Of course, the other sort of practice that is used often to talk about AI is self-governance through certain ethical principles and guidelines. And again, those have existed for a while. We know that the WHO had AI-related guidelines for use of AI in healthcare. Even within India, we've had Niti Aayog's Responsible AI for All, which was put out, I think, in 2017, and the ICMR, which is the Indian Council of Medical Research's guidelines from 2023, which are specifically to clinical, for use of AI systems within clinical settings. But again, at best, they are guidelines and they are non-enforceable and rely heavily on self-governance. And of course, there's also this additional challenge that some of these guidelines or ethical guidelines, when actually put to practice, we've heard from practitioners that it's difficult to really see how these ideas are ported to certain sectors, to certain very specific contexts in which the AI systems are being used or applied. So this is the sort of gap that we see in which we talk about audits and whether or not audits can act as some sort of a quasi regulatory framework. And to talk a little bit about audits, I mean, we've had audits for a long time. We've had financial audits in certain, critical settings. And the primary role of audits is to create sort of greater accountability and transparency. And within healthcare, I don't think at least in our research, we didn't find that a lot of organizations were currently doing audits, but there are certain sort of research materials that are available that talk about how one can do audits within healthcare settings. So we highlight from secondary research certain frameworks that came up in our secondary research. One of which is algorithmic vigilance, which essentially looks at automated statistical tests to monitor the performance of certain AI systems, but it also has built-in assessments of human factors and takes into account human decision making as well. There is an ethical AI framework, which, as the name suggests, also assesses the system's performance, but against certain critical ethical principles that often also overlap with principles of bioethics, which is principles of autonomy, principles of non-maleficence, justice, and sustainability. One of the other more detailed audit frameworks that we found was the medical algorithmic audit framework. That is, it is built with the goal to preempt errors and biases during the development process and identify corrective measures at that stage. And this is sort of the framework that this was published in the Lancet Digital Health way back in 2022, that gives a little bit of an understanding around how at each stage one can go about conducting an audit of this nature. Of course, this presupposes that one has access to the source of the data, one has access to the trained algorithm and various other things. But on principle, these are, I think, at this point, some secondary around how audits could work. The other question, of course, is, who conducts these audits, whether it is internally done or externally done. And we, in our research, found, at least in the secondary, we found that, there are pros and cons to both. Internal audits could allow for greater access to certain, the data sources, for example, or the source code in certain instances, while external audits perhaps create greater accountability because it has, a third party element to it, and can be better for public transparency and accountability. With that, I think we move to really some of the key findings that we have for this study, and the way the findings are organized is really across the data supply chain framework. So we really look at each of the data sourcing, processing, model development, and deployment, and look at what are some of the things that we heard from practitioners when it comes to their sort of processes available for data sourcing, processing, and so on. So to start with data sourcing. So what we found, and please feel free to let me know. I think there's quite a bit of quantitative data here. So if there's anything that I may have to explain further, do let me know, or if I'm going too fast. So one of the things that we found, and here you'll see that, we have responses from all the three sets of stakeholders: healthcare institutions, technology companies, and medical professionals. If you see that, this particular bar graph, you can see that almost all stakeholders said that they use an equal mix of open and proprietary data. And this has certain consequences, and we're going to get into that in a bit. But if we move on, we also saw, for example, that that this idea was confirmed, that there is reliance on both open and proprietary data sets. For example, somebody told us that teleradiology companies are the largest source of data for AI related imaging, and most of the training data comes from India, but some of it also comes from the Europe or UK. We also heard that, of course, that they take two approaches, where there is publicly available data sets as well as private data sets. But at this point, a lot of the public data sets are mostly non-Indian data sets, and mostly from American and European institutions. But they're also trying to work with local stakeholders to build more indigenous data sets. What we also found was that there is a reliance on data sets from the global north, and here you will see the ones that are sort of asterisked are the ones that actually tell you that those data sets are from the global north. So across the three stakeholders: healthcare institutions, medical professionals, and technology companies, we found that there is some reliance on open source data sets from other countries. Of course, for healthcare institutions, you will see that their largest source is data from medical service providers, potentially because some of that data the institutions hold in themselves and therefore are able to use that. But for technology companies, for example, a lot of the data was either open data from global north data sets or proprietary data sources, in the absence of having this very sort of easy access to data. So again, I think to contextualize some of this, our interviewees also told us that, there is a risk of introducing bias when we are relying on external data sets. And as a clinical doctor told us that if, the 90% saturation, let's say, is normal for, certain populations, but if you hold that as high in the context of benchmarking it against another population, then you may risk creating a model that is actually biased. And they go on to say that the marriage of the medical and collected knowledge and clinical knowledge has unfortunately not happened, which also points to some amount of sort of siloed development of some of these systems, and also how then that can lead to creeping in of certain biases within the systems. Again, this is something that we've seen also globally, like, for example, the second quote where they say that, to detect something, most of the data sets are European or from the US, and there are differences in communities. And when algorithms are trained on data sets from different communities, they are trained to look for abnormalities in a certain way that may not work for Indian community, Indian bodies, or certain types of communities. So those are really sort of, we thought, critical insights into why the data source question is really important as we think about developing AI systems. Moving on to data processing. And here we really looked at, so the intention of asking these questions was to also understand if there are various data related checks that organizations have put in place to really look at, certain processing activities. And to some extent, we also saw these as audit related checks because there were certain evaluation techniques that different organizations were doing, which came up to be, could be proxies for a certain point in time audit checks. So if we see here, both the healthcare and technology companies really sort of reported conducting several data quality related checks while collecting medical data. If you see here, I think ensuring proper feedback mechanisms across the data supply chain was a really key one here, but also evaluating the source of data was a key one. Performing validation checks and cleaning the data to make it usable for AI systems was again also something that came up a lot. But one of the things, again, was that the data processing stage is very resource intensive. It requires extensive processing and cleaning for it to be made useful, for it to be then used for developing AI systems. And this also sort of raised that question of, like, where is that work? Who is doing that work, and where is that work being put into? And is that when there is scarcity of resources, especially in the healthcare context, is that the most efficient use? Are questions that came up really when we saw the amount of work that is required in data processing. For example, we heard that we need a lot of annotators to actually double check the quality of the image. You also not just need annotators, but you need a lot of expertise to ensure that the images in themselves of good quality, and that they are annotated well. There's others who told us about errors in screening, if the labeling is not right. So even certain minor sort of inaccuracies can lead to essentially big sort of errors or consequences, especially in safety critical settings such as healthcare. Then this was again an important question that we asked about whether there are certain technical checks that are being applied, whether it comes to benchmark data sets and imbalance in data sets. Benchmark data sets essentially refers to resources that are published explicitly as data sets that can be used for evaluation and are often publicly available. And we saw that 70% of technology companies are actually looking into using 77% are using benchmark data sets, and 67% healthcare institutions are using benchmark data sets. But when it actually came to looking at imbalance in data sets, which is essentially a data issue that arises due to the non-uniform distribution of samples, we found that a lot lesser healthcare institutions were actually looking into imbalance in data sets. In various conversations, we've also heard that, the evaluation against benchmark datasets may not often be very useful, but perhaps we can get into a conversation and love to hear from others on how you think about that as well. More on cleaning medical data, we saw that various types of organizations had various practices. The key ones being the attempts to debias the data sets to mitigate any inequities for underrepresented groups. And again, like the standardization of the data format was something that was much more important for the technology companies than the healthcare companies, as you can see in the last graph here. One of the things that we found is that PII protocols is an important priority for all stakeholders. And our understanding also was given that, the healthcare sector in itself has been dealing with sensitive patient data for a long time, that, these protocols were a lot more sort of easier to implement, or something that organizations were doing for a longer time, and therefore, coming more naturally in the healthcare context. So as you can see here, 59% of medical professionals say that they implement strong encryption methods to secure PII during data transmission and storage. 46% said that they ensure access to patient data is restricted to authorized personnel only as well. Then for all data that, doctors also told us that for all the data that they collect, the consent is a very mandatory feature, and it is explicitly mentioned that the data will be used for certain purposes. So this also points to how, whether the data is being used for a particular purpose and whether it is then being used for different reasons is something that is also happening or not. Then coming to data handling, and I know a lot of this is fairly technical, but we really wanted to kind of understand, are there certain very specific practices that organizations are doing? And again, one of the big things that was coming up when it came to data handling at the stage of handling was that a lot of organizations were concerned about anonymizing personal information, and also about having policies and processes to handle security breaches. Of course, we also know that there have been certain security breaches with healthcare data in the past, because of which we also suspect that, the security breaches processes have been put in place. So our sense is also that some of this has to do with compliance to certain kinds of regulations, to certain kinds of requirements, which have led to some of these practices being more institutional, having been in the institution for longer than others as well. Then we move on to, the data learning and model development stage. Typically, this is the stage where, the algorithm is being trained. For the purposes of this study, we were more concerned with thinking about what is the sort of collaboration and feedback loops that exist between different stakeholders, because we know that the, algorithm training is a fairly iterative process. So we wanted to see whether different stakeholders are actually involved in this very iterative stage of the AI development. And, and sorry, this is a fairly, complicated graph. I think we could have designed this better, but the key thing here is that if you see technology companies, they told us that only 26% of technology companies actually collaborate with doctors when they are developing or deploying AI systems, which was concerning, because doctors are a key stakeholder when it comes to developing AI systems. And this kind of low sort of, interaction with, in some senses, the end user, which is the doctors who are often deploying these systems, was not surprising, but definitely concerning for us. As a researcher who works on AI audits and human rights told us that a lot of organizations with no experience in healthcare are entering the space through AI. And sometimes these organizations often, risk packaging some sort of discredited science into AI models, and then, they get hard-coded, which can have its own set of problems. We also looked at feedback sharing as a mechanism during the phase of model development. And again, we found that only 55% of medical professionals we surveyed actually provide regular feedback on the AI systems that they use. And of those that they actually provide feedback, most of them do so by participating in research. So there is very limited sort of direct interaction with the AI developer, most of it is through participating in research processes. Again, really pointing to that sort of like brokenness within that ecosystem where, a lot of the work is happening in silos and the systems are being developed without actually, testing it in real world environments or being developed with key stakeholders in mind. Finally, when it comes to model deployment, here we were trying to understand, okay, when it's deployed, a lot of the model deployment right now is more in the stages of pilot and prototyping to see, accuracy and efficacy of these models. And we found that there's a lot of hesitation and lack of trust in AI systems amongst medical professionals. A lot of medical professionals said that they face challenges in integrating AI systems into their clinical workflows, that they're not confident in the technology, and they also have fear of being replaced. And they also sometimes felt that, the acceptance for this, both amongst the patient populations as well as the medical, professionals, is fairly low. Then there was also this bit where we wanted to understand that, where are these AI systems when they're being deployed in clinical settings, where are they coming from? And a lot of this was actually coming from external vendors such as startups and technology companies. And this was a point about the fragmented nature of the market of these AI products, where somebody said that when it comes to a CT or an ultrasound machine, there are clear protocols, there are clear knowledge of vendors from where these systems need to be procured. But when it came to AI vendors, there was sort of like a confusion on what are the sort of standards or benchmarks against which an AI system needs to be looked at or evaluated, and then how does one procure it, and how does one then integrate it also into their existing hospital ecosystems as well. We also found, of course, at the deployment stage that there's a lack of training and education professionals in the use of AI. And doctors also pointed to this as a gap, saying that, they also feel sort of that they're not trained enough to be and do not have enough awareness around how these AI systems need to be used. They often relied on a lot of online resources to understand using AI systems in their clinical settings as well. This I will move on to. Then I'll come to AI audits very quickly. So AI audits, again, for us, AI audits, we tried to explain this in our survey in the form of evaluations or tests that organizations may conduct, or certain checks and balances that organizations may have as they develop and deploy these systems, because audit in itself, it was not a term that was very well known or well understood amongst various stakeholders. So, and that's something that we also heard from, various interviewees who have some sense of the AI healthcare ecosystem. They said that, we don't usually use the word audit, but we think about validations, and what is the process that someone uses to validate an AI model, who has been involved in that process, and who has signed off on the process, and so on. We also heard from medical ethics committees who said that, there should be more regular audits because there are diagnostic tools that are being put into hospitals without enough checks and balances. And right now the gold standard is the doctor. But who does that audit? And therefore it should be audited against, let's say, a doctor's, if the doctor is held to be the gold standard, so it should be audited against that measure. What we found is that there are certain protocols or compliances that organizations are following. Like we said, there are certain compliances around data retention, data storage that organizations are now increasingly following. Also, because the conversation around data storage, data privacy, security has been in the discourse for a while now, for upwards of 10 years, where we've been talking about data security and data privacy and data protection more generally. So we saw that, policies for data storage is something that most organizations prioritize. There's also, audits or processes for cleaning data for AI use. That was also something that we heard was something that a lot of tech companies and healthcare institutions were focused on, less so for medical practitioners. And of course, if you see the privacy and security measures, we see that almost all stakeholders were equally sort of interested in or invested in looking at or reviewing and evaluating privacy and security measures for the data that they collect. With that, I think I'll come to sort of the recommendations that we had for this study. And our recommendations are broadly in sort of three groups, not really in terms of the stakeholders, but data management, audits, and industrial policy. So as we sort of, just to recap, I mean, we looked a lot at what the data supply chain is really telling us. Where is the data coming from? What are the checks that are being applied? What are the challenges that are being faced? And that's where we talk about standardizing data sharing policies. At least in India, there are certain sort of steps that are being taken to collect more data. And there is some significant amount of effort through the ABDM processes and others to collect data. The challenge is that not all of that data is being collected in a sort of interoperable format. Often that data is not very usable in the way that it's collected, but also that it creates a lot of pressure on, especially so in the public healthcare system, where there are a lot of community healthcare workers who are tasked with the collection of the data. So how do we create more robust mechanisms without creating additional burdens on various stakeholders in the healthcare community, especially so for the public health communities, public health workers, is something that we think about in this standardization of data sharing policies, and also thinking about providing guidelines for the implementers and their capacity to adopt AI, so that there are more clear guidelines on what should be the process from data collection to actual implementation or adoption of AI. And again, we talk about maintenance of interoperability along with data collection, and that there are the data quality process, the data collection process in itself should not be burdensome on various actors who may already be overburdened within the healthcare system. For AI auditing, we suggest that you standardize certain practices of AI auditing. AI auditing has not been tested in a very robust way yet. There is a need for it to be tested through different settings, building organizational knowledge, thinking about how can more stakeholders collaborate in this auditing process, ultimately with the sort of goal of creating more accountability and transparency through these processes. So essentially thinking about more participatory approaches to AI audit. We know that there, in various contexts, there's also social audits that happen where different stakeholders, civil society actors actually think about how can we create more transparency in certain public systems, for example, and can similar approaches be thought about when we think about AI auditing as a form of governance particularly for healthcare. Lastly, we talk about prioritizing public value in India's AI industrial policy, and I would imagine that this also applies in various other geographic contexts, because the sort of some of the promise of AI is for it to help with the already burdened healthcare systems, to create certain efficiencies, to reduce certain burdens, and provide greater access and affordability. And if that is the promise of AI, then how can we move more intentionally with the use of AI to actually solve that problem? Often in various settings, we see that the solution comes in first and the problem is then retrofitted. So we actually suggest that we have more focused and transparent approaches to investments and financing of AI projects. We recommend that there is an equitable distribution of AI spending and associated benefits. In some of the interviews, we actually heard that the price points for some of these systems right now are quite high and are currently mostly accessible in private settings, while the need actually exists in a lot more in public healthcare settings. So how do we think about more equitable distribution of benefits, if any, from AI systems? And we also suggest that we also heard from different startups that there are like point in time funding, and within 6 months you have to develop a product, and there's a lot of pressure. So obviously that creates a lot of pressure into the entire system, but also on the quality of the product. And we suggest that there is greater investment in AI life cycles as opposed to just a initial development sort of funding. We also suggest greater transparency in public-private partnerships. Recently, the India AI Mission has been putting out a lot of sort of calls for public empanelment, which are encouraged. but to also create more transparency on how, once these vendors are impaneled, what are the kind of activities that are being taken up, or also what are the use cases and what are the areas of healthcare or other sectors that are being prioritized when it comes to PPPs, to also think about public good over business outcomes. And then finally, we suggest for greater strengthening of regulatory checks and balances. We know that, right now there is a moment where we're not really there's a lot of sort of geopolitical intention on thinking about whether we want to regulate or not. And so to think about then transparency starting from the drafting process, if at all there are certain AI related regulations, to ensure that the processes are multi-stakeholder, that it involves different actors in the regulatory processes. And this is something that has been recommended for a long time now across, I think, different global processes. But again, we reiterate that. And also, I think one such step is the recent talks about creating an AI safety institute. We know that, again, in various countries, AI safety institutes have been put in place. In India, they are also saying that it will be a multi-stakeholder body, that there will be academics, researchers, but how do you make that more robust and transparent and involve various stakeholders? So I think with that, I will pause. I hope I have not gone too over time. And this is the QR code for our report.